Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Pope's essay on criticism is honestly a text that makes me a little angry. And the reason it makes me angry is because it's so good. When I am, if I'm writing an academic essay, I write in a certain way. But if someone said to me, hey, I want you to write an essay about criticism, but I want you to write it as poetry, and I also want you to put in their principles that can be used to criticize the very thing that you're writing, I'd be pretty intimidated by that. And Alexander Pope, he does just that. So it makes me a little angry how good he is, to be honest. But I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of this. So one of the important elements of Pope's essay on criticism is, I think it really is one of the best, if not the best, explanations of the neoclassical artistic idea. The neoclassical idea is essentially the idea that in order to write well, you should write the way that people wrote in the classical era. And as we'll see, Pope is actually talking about something different than saying that that's the only way to write, rather something different. But let's start with his question about criticism. He actually opens it with an issue. And this is the first lines of his essay on criticism, the first part. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill." So he opens with this issue. He says, it's hard to say whether it's harder to be a writer or harder to be a critic of writing. And often I think we have the bias in our culture to say, well, critics are ones who can't actually do the thing. And so the best they can do is sit back and criticize what someone else does. But of course, the best critics can do the things that they're doing. Like they're coming from a position of authority as masters of the thing itself. And as we're going to see with Pope, he's going to talk about that. But of the two, that is to say, writing or producing art or criticizing art, less dangerous is the offense to tire our patience than to mislead our sense. And he says, you know what? It's less dangerous, though, for someone to write something or to produce art that's bad and we just have no patience with it, than to mislead us. Very few in that, but numbers are in this. 10 cents you're wrong for one who writes amiss. So he's like, yeah, for every one person who produces a bad piece of writing, 10 people produce bad criticism. A fool might himself once alone expose. Now one in verse makes many more in prose. And so this is both an act of composition, creative composition, but also an act of criticism itself. And in it, what he basically says is, look, I'm not going to talk about whether it's harder to be a good writer or harder to be a good critic. Though once you're done reading this, you kind of get the sense he thinks it's harder to be a good critic because he thinks that's built upon being creative and being a good writer in some ways. But he says it's much more dangerous to be a bad critic. And I think there is a lot of sense to this. And the reason I think there's a lot of sense to this, I think our own experience sees it. I remember back in the 90s, when the 1990s, not the 1790s, when the internet started allowing anyone to do a criticism of something, anyone to critique something and post it online. And so you can go to Rotten Tomatoes and see movie reviews now. You can go to Goodreads and see book reviews. There are reviews of everything now. Everyone now is a reviewer. Whereas before that time, before the advent of the internet, you did get the sense, or didn't just get the sense, there were really only a handful of people who were the important reviewers. They were published in the big metropolitan newspapers, or the magazines that had a national subscription base, and they mattered. And the fact that you over the water cooler told someone what you thought of something didn't matter quite so much. And there was this argument that now we're going to get a lot more interesting reads. We're going to get a lot more people who come at it from new ways that could never break through before. But what happened instead? Well, all you have to do is get online to see, for anything, any product, any work of art, anything. Basically, you find people saying the same things over and over again. And the truth is, the democratization of criticism, surprisingly to me, has had the reverse effect. It has made people less bold, made criticism less interesting than it was before. And Pope, I think, way back in the early 18th century, he wrote this in 1709, it was published in 1711. I think Pope already sees that. Obviously, he doesn't predict the internet, but he sees that that is the impulse, that like as soon as one person criticizes something wrongly, everyone's going to follow him. And we see that again and again through this. So what makes a good criticism versus a bad criticism? Well, he gets into that here, and I want to spend the rest of this video really focusing on that. This starts on line 46 of part 1. But you who seek to give and merit fame, you who seek to say, hey, this person should be considered an important artist and this person should not be, and justly bear a critic's noble name and be called a critic justly, be sure yourself and your own reach to know. Okay, know thyself. He's not the first person to say this. How far your genius, taste, and learning go. And I want to focus on those three: genius, taste, and learning, because I think they are in some ways misunderstood. So let's start with learning. That's the easiest one. How well have you learned? Obviously, if you don't know a lot about a subject, your ability to criticize it is really limited. All you can say is, well, I know what I like and I didn't like that. Fine, but that doesn't really tell us much of anything other than about your own preferences, right? And so we all know this. One thing that you'll get on online forums and you'll see people writing about things. You're like, oh, that sounds right. That sounds smart. But the second you get on an online forum about something that you know about, that you're an expert in, you will quickly find, oh, the top comments, the upvoted comments, the ones that are at the front, they're the ones that everyone's praising as being smart. These people don't know what they're talking about because I know about this. And you start to suspect wisely that maybe places where you also don't know about, maybe the thing that seems smart to you is in fact just ridiculously wrong. And so you need to, as a critic, start to say like, well, I'm not going to talk about a thing that I don't really know about, that I haven't learned well about. And a lot of people won't do that. I found something, for example, recently. I had a YouTube video, won't name the one, where I had more comments on that video on a social network than actual views of the video, which means that some people were commenting and based on just the title. Obviously they didn't learn about it. So their comments are worthless. Even if their comments happen to be right, they only happen to be right. There's no learning behind it. All right, so taste. Taste is this kind of ineffable, hard to put your finger on thing, right? There's a sense in which some people have good taste and some people have bad taste. And later on this, he's going to talk about taste being like a watch, and everyone thinks that their own watch is right. I'll often talk about how, tolerance for something, right? Everyone thinks their own tolerance is perfect. Anyone who's less tolerant than me is uptight and stuffy. Anyone who's more tolerant than me is loosey-goosey and they have no standards, right? I am the perfect one. And everyone feels that way. And we have lots of things about this where we feel like we are baby bear, where mama bears is too cold, papa bears is too hot, but baby bears is just right. And we are always the baby bear, right? Everything that we have is exactly at the right level. Um, and so this is a difficult thing to know. And he talks a lot about taste in this, but I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to talk about the other one, genius, because I think this is the one that's least understood of these. Genius, today, when we say genius, we typically use it in common conversation to mean something that is someone that has exceptional intellect, exceptional IQ. But that's a newer meaning of the term. In fact, the word genius meant originally something more like a creative spirit. And literally, in some cases, a spirit, literally like a family spirit that you inherited and comes into you. And so, related words that are related to genius aren't words so much about intelligence. They're words like gender, right? Generation, gens, if you know any Latin, right? Words that have to do with reproduction and creativity. Like literally, you are a creative person because you have a creative spirit in you. So, in fact, you could have genius but have no learning. An uneducated person can just have this creative spirit. And someone who's studied and studied and studied and maybe has very good taste might themselves not be able to create. They might just not have that creative spirit in them. Is essentially what he's arguing. And so I think in there we see one of the reasons that he puts the critic above the writer or any kind of artist is to say, you know what? The critic also needs to be creative. The critic needs to be a creator, not just creative in their turn of a phrase, but someone who can create the thing itself, right? And until they know how to create the thing itself, that person really cannot be said to have genius, and thus cannot be said to have cannot be said to be a good critic. And you might be thinking like, well, how do you know that's what he means? Well, our modern understanding or late modern understanding of the word genius to mean like someone of exceptional intellect, the first recorded use of that is in 1711. That's the year that Pope published his essay on criticism, and he finished writing it in 1709. So the idea is just below the surface percolating, that there's something about intellect and creativity, that there's some connection, but Pope isn't there yet. And so with Pope, when he talks about genius here and throughout, he's talking about the creative spirit. So when you read an essay on criticism, and he gets to the neoclassical idea, and he says you need to write like the Greeks wrote, he's not saying just carbon copy what they had. They did it right, and you can't do it right. No. He very much is interested in genius, that is to say, the creative spirit. What he argues throughout this is you want to write like the classical world, he argues, because they didn't make the rules, but rather they discovered the rules. And as you read throughout the essay on criticism, you'll see he says that again and again, that they didn't make the rules, but the rules are there because they discovered them. In the same way that Isaac Newton didn't invent gravity, he simply discovered it or described its properties properly, right? And that there are many ways in which we can't say that someone invented something, rather that they discovered it. So if someone says this violates the laws of physics, you can't have Congress pass a law to change the laws of physics, right? The laws of physics are not that kind of law. We don't determine them, we discover them. And he argues that great art is also governed by certain rules, and those rules are ones that were discovered. And you want to create within those rules. Not because he's trying to suppress your creative urge, but rather to say they discovered that that's the way to do it. So if you're going to be an engineer and you want to create something, you need to create that thing within the rules of physics. And within those rules, within those laws, that's where true creativity, the ability to make something good, comes. And within that, the great critic then, having that same spirit, but also taste and learning, can then give proper praise and to disassemble something and take it apart and say, this is why it works this way, and this is why it doesn't work this way. And so when you see really good criticism, online or someplace else, what you'll notice is that the good critics are not the ones who just say, this was thumbs up, thumbs down. This is not good. This was not bad. 5-star, 4 stars. You'll notice that really, really good and interesting critics, they rarely say, I liked it or I didn't like it. Instead, they kind of show how it works, and maybe through implication say, well, I didn't like this or I like this. But more largely, they connected it in some way to the broader artistic world and showed how this thing was itself either creative or was not creative, how it followed the rules of art or did not follow the rules of art. And so ultimately, in essay and criticism, I think this idea of genius here is not for Pope is not the central idea for helping us understand this, but for us, because we've changed what we mean by genius, when we come to understand what he means by genius, I think for us that can very much be the key for understanding not just the ideas he's expressing here, but ultimately the entire neoclassical idea for how art should work.